They say miracles rarely happen, but my tale is filled with shocking twists. Looking back, it's hard to imagine all of this even occurred, but I suppose that's the beauty of life. It works in the strangest ways. My name is Ethan, and this is my story. Growing up, I always looked up to my parents. Both of them had been immensely supportive figures throughout my childhood, and my father, Russell, was someone I greatly admired. He was an extraordinary person and taught me everything there was. He was resourceful, intellectual, and a true gentleman who tried his best to provide my mother and me with a fulfilling and loving home. My father worked as a senior analyst at a retail corporation downtown and spent nearly a decade rising to the role. He'd earned the loyalty of the company's CEO when he worked in a lower position and was promoted instantly due to his sharp insights and relentless work ethic. By all accounts, he was an exemplary employee and enjoyed his time at the corporation while ensuring the best life for my mother and me. But as life would have had it, good things rarely last. A rather blissful childhood soon evolved into a nightmare after my father returned home from work one day. My mother and I had never seen him this way. He looked furious and exhausted. He remained silent for a day and wished to be left alone, but the next day he finally confessed that he'd been let go from his job. I was shocked at the news. He was an excellent employee who thoroughly enjoyed his job. How could he possibly be fired? My mother pestered him for details, but my father didn't wish to divulge any. Throughout my childhood, this was the first time I'd seen him look so defeated. Unfortunately, things worsened over time. Faced with unemployment, my father sought out blue-collar jobs to make ends meet and worked for long hours at a stretch. It was undeniable, however, that his usual spirit and resilience were now completely gone. My mother felt especially troubled at the sight of my father, often telling him that he seemed like a shadow of his former self without any explanation. Her every question was only met with avoidance by my father, and gradually, the peace from our once joyful home disappeared. As I transitioned from high school to college, another tragic turn lay ahead for our family. I returned home from college one afternoon and overheard my parents discussing a serious medical complication. They immediately dropped the subject when they saw me, and my mother tried to assure me that everything was fine. However, the look on my father's face said it all. Things had gotten worse. Although I wasn't explicitly told, it was clear that my father was suffering from a severe illness. He struggled with odd jobs and was on heavy medications. His condition continued to deteriorate while showing little to no signs of progress. My mother and I were quite worried, as we'd never seen him in such a poor state. He'd been diagnosed with high blood pressure and some other complications, and we were seriously concerned about his health. As months went by, my father kept slipping into a downward spiral, and it all culminated in a heartbreaking event that shattered us forever. It was a year later during spring break. I was leaving college with some friends when I saw my mother waiting outside campus in our car. "Mom, what are you doing here?" "Nothing. Just thought I'd surprise you, that's all." "There's something I have to tell you." "What is it, Mom? What's happened?" "Let's get in the car and I'll explain, sweetie." My mother hugged me and we drove away. There was a brief silence and an unmistakable worry on her face. "Mom, what's wrong? Why don't you tell me?" Within minutes, tears flowed down her face. She struggled to speak, mumbling something about my father, but I had no clue of what was to come. We skipped the route home and pulled into the parking lot of the local hospital. My blood went cold. What had happened to Dad? My mother led me to the ICU, where we met with a couple of doctors. Turns out my father had suffered a heart attack and had collapsed. The doctors were monitoring him, but there was no certainty about his condition. I was devastated by the news. My mother and I wept and consoled each other for hours in the waiting room, hoping for a miracle. It felt like the picture-perfect childhood I'd known all my life was about to crumble instantly. And as evening approached, everything fell apart. The doctors stepped out of the ICU to speak to my mother and me. "I'm sorry. We tried our best, but his condition was beyond saving. We're very sorry for your loss." I was numbed after hearing those words. Everything felt like a blur, like it couldn't be true. My mother broke down and wept like never before, while I sat processing what had just happened. My father was no more. I cried hard sometime later, unable to contain my grief. My mother and I were crushed beyond belief. We had no idea what our life looked like now. The weeks and months that followed were a daze, and while my father had left us a good amount of money, it wouldn't last forever. I returned to college sometime later, but life wasn't the same again, nor would it ever be. My mother sought out some jobs but struggled with employment. Certain debts were to be paid, and I spent a better part of college working a part-time job to support my mother. The year I graduated seemed to provide the two of us some relief. It was a beautiful milestone in my life, and after my father's death, the celebratory moment brought us closer. My mother worked as a secretary, and most of my father's debts had been paid, but now the pressure of finding a job loomed over me. There were still a few debts to be paid in addition to my student loan. I applied to many companies, including the one my father worked at. I didn't expect a reply since they were a pretty prestigious firm. However, 2 weeks later, I was called in for an interview. I was extremely nervous, but my mother assured me I could secure the position, especially given my father's record in the company. Dressed in my sharpest suit and trying not to feel too anxious, I visited the firm for the interview. There were multiple applicants apart from me, and when it was finally my turn, I entered the room as confidently as possible. The HR manager, Lloyd, welcomed me inside and briefly discussed my resume. "This is a pretty impressive track record here, Ethan. Also, correct me if I'm wrong, but you're Russell's son, aren't you?" "Yes, sir. That's right. My father worked here for nearly 10 years. Lloyd flashed a warm smile. "I knew him well. He was a great man. Left under some strange circumstances. Anyway, we'll get back to you soon." I left the room feeling confident but curious about my father's past. What did Lloyd mean by strange circumstances? My father had never been too clear on why he was fired, and this ambiguous line from Lloyd only fueled my curiosity. I'd find out soon enough, because a few days later I received a call from Lloyd confirming my employment. I was overjoyed and celebrated the news with my mother. She'd endured a lot in the wake of my father's death, and it was incredible how she'd raised me alone despite so many obstacles. Finally, things were looking right for both of us. After signing the offer letter from Lloyd, I started as a junior analyst at the company. However, my first day itself had much in store for me. While I settled at my desk, a tall, senior figure walked around the floor with Lloyd tagging behind him. As they approached my desk, Lloyd took a moment to introduce the senior man to me. "Ethan. Good to see you settled in. This is Mr. Logan Donovan. He's your superior?" I stood up to greet Logan, but he studied me closely before shaking my hand. "Why do you look so familiar to me, sir?" "He's actually Russell's son, Ethan, the analyst." Logan's eyes lit up with shock. "Well, that's incredible. Your father was a great man. Hope you can live up to his legacy." He shook my hand and walked away. I felt proud, knowing the impact my father had left on his peers, but there was a shocking revelation that awaited me later. During lunch, Logan summoned me to his office. "Come in, Ethan. Shut the door and take a seat." As I settled across him, Logan took a deep breath, as if preparing to deliver important news. "You know, I was a great admirer of Russell. He was a hard worker, but even he started somewhere. He had to work his way up." "I'm aware, sir." I was curious where this was leading. "Ethan, what I'm trying to say is that you're asking quite a bit of money for a junior analyst. Your father wasn't paid half of this." "But sir, times have changed. I think I have the necessary skills." "Well, I don't think so. I think you're yet to prove yourself, so tell you what, we'll start you off on a lower salary, just so you get a hang of the system. Can't have everything the easy way, can we?" I felt blindsided by Logan's request. I'd worked considerably hard in college, and I couldn't believe someone like him, who knew my father, would try to lowball me this way. "Sir, if you're asking me to take a salary less than half of what I signed on for, I don't think I'd be okay with that." Logan sighed, but it was clear he was playing at something else. "I knew you'd say that, and the reason I'm asking you for this is because your father got fired for the same reason." The very mention of my father made me extremely curious. For years, we'd wondered why he'd been fired. "I don't know if he ever told you, but he was fired because he asked for too much. This company is owned by my father, Mr. Donovan. Now, he saw immense potential in Russell, but because Russell demanded too much, my father fired him. I argued his case and defended him, but my father didn't want to hear it. You see, that's what you and I have in common, Ethan. My father's the CEO, yet I still run one tiny department. But we both will see better days, so let's not complain, yeah?" I didn't know what to make of Logan's strange confession. I was shattered and confused, but Logan assured me that he was on my side. My father had always been tight-lipped about his departure from the firm, but now the truth was out, or so I thought. My mind raced as I thought about what I'd just heard. If my father had been let go for asking too much, perhaps I should endure lower pay for some time if it meant working at such a prestigious firm. But this was possibly the stupidest decision I'd ever make. After a lengthy conversation with Logan, I agreed to a lower pay until further notice. That day, I contacted my mother and we spoke about how my father was let go. It was painful to think that after 10 years of service, he'd been let go because he asked for a bigger raise and promotion. I wasn't too keen on the lower pay myself, but I was a new employee and wanted to stick around in the firm, so I complied with Logan's demands. The first week at the office was thrilling. The projects were exciting, and I had the opportunity to work for major clients. My first large-scale project was quite a task, but thankfully, one of my older coworkers gladly assisted me. Her name was Jean, and she'd been with the company for a significant time. She was one of the brightest and most intellectual people working in the office. With Jean's help, I was able to successfully execute my first project. It felt like a dream come true to have such coworkers and the opportunity for such work. I believed I'd struck gold with the company, but this bliss was short-lived. Time started to fly, but the workload only intensified. Logan started piling more projects onto me than I could handle, and it became overwhelming. I anticipated a lot of work since I'd seen my father toil away day and night, but this level of workload felt excessive. Logan was eager to capture major clients and kept overworking employees to the point of exhaustion. I'd send some money home to my mother while using the rest to pay my bills. I wanted to ensure she could live comfortably without having to work, but the toll of my job was undeniable. The most discerning part was that Logan wasn't an outright ruthless boss. He had this forced optimism he'd push down our throats to keep us working, while never doing anything to resolve our concerns. I met with him once to revise the lower pay agreement, but to no avail. "Sir," I was thinking, "I've been here 6 months now and I've been pushing myself for every single project. Don't you think I've proved enough? Could we return to the original pay deal?" "Ethan, I've told you this dozens of times, we're all making sacrifices. You have to as well. The best things in life won't just fall into your lap. Your father worked for 10 years, you've only worked for half of a year. Give it time, boy." His words seemed like those of an old and encouraging mentor, but that couldn't have been further from the truth of who this man really was. I started to convince myself that this is what corporate culture ultimately was, and all the employees reluctantly put up with Logan's demands. However, even though everyone agreed to the workload, there was a shocking incident a year later. It caught us all off guard. It had to do with Jean. 1 year later, after a successful project with a very major client, Jean was called in by Logan and there was a long conversation. All of us were quite eager and there were rumors of a massive promotion for Jean. But these rumors were instantly squashed after we heard screaming from Logan's cabin. Jean stormed out tearfully. She packed her things and walked out. The office burst into whispers and I could hardly believe what I'd just seen. What had Logan done? None of us had to speculate much as he came outside to address us. "As all of you witnessed Jean's exit, I'm officially announcing that she's no longer working with us anymore. She made a grave mistake while communicating with one of our biggest clients, and that's unforgivable. I got orders from the higher-ups, and that's that, folks." Logan stood there in silence while the rest of us grappled with the suddenness of what had just unfolded. I just couldn't wrap my head around it. Jean was one of the most competent and kind-hearted people I'd ever met, and she was gone in an instant. Fired. Just like that. She had always been so helpful and patient with me. Seeing her reduced to tears, humiliated in front of everyone, felt like a personal blow. And then suddenly, something unexpected happened. Logan didn't return to his office and stood before all of us. Rather unexpectedly, he started to cry. The whispers in the office grew louder as Logan wept for a bit and then finally spoke, wiping away his tears. "I hate being put in this position every time. My father's a ruthless tyrant and I just feel so pressurized all the time. I love all of you so much and we're a team. I couldn't fight hard enough for Jean, but I vow to fight hard for every one of you." There was mild applause and some people consoled Logan with tissues, but I couldn't help feeling some falsehood behind his words. As if this were a fake show put on for us. None of us had any idea, however, that things were about to become worse. Jean's shocking departure had sent ripples across the office, and everyone wondered whether they were next in this bizarre situation. It seemed like everyone's job was at risk and we couldn't possibly predict what was next. A few months after Jean's firing, Logan became stricter and far more controlling. His generally calm facade started to crack. The workload remained at an all-time high, but Logan's behavior stunned everyone. To boost productivity, Logan began implementing time limits for employee breaks. He believed that for every extra minute crossed, the employee would have to work overtime as compensation. It was a ridiculous policy, but we couldn't protest as Logan shut down anyone who showed dissent. A few employees took the matter up with Lloyd from HR, but he admitted that his hands were tied too and that he could be fired for raising any complaints. It was an undoubtedly hostile environment, but things worsened after one significant event. While all of us were on lunch break once, one of the employees, Dan, had to attend to an urgent call from his wife. The rest of us returned to the office, while Dan stayed an extra 10 minutes in the cafeteria. Logan noted Dan's late arrival but said nothing, and we'd not anticipated what would happen next. The following day, Logan addressed all employees once again, asking us to gather around as he made an announcement. "I'm afraid I have terrible news. I had a meeting with the board and we discussed employee performance. Now, I've given all of you specific breaks, but Dan broke the rule." There were shocks and murmurs across the room, but more importantly, Dan was nowhere to be found. The board found several sensitive emails on Dan's laptop and he was involved in a serious offense against the company. We're looking into the case details, but Dan has been let go. It was honestly baffling to hear about Dan's firing. To think that such a hardworking employee had been let go at a moment's notice felt like a puzzling decision. Dan had been a reliable colleague and friend. The suddenness of his dismissal was a terrible shock. The incident only fueled speculation among the employees about the office culture. A few weeks following this incident, a couple of employees, including myself, started meeting in secret to talk about Logan, our little rebellion forming over breaks and quick exchanges in the office. There were 6 of us, and we discussed the next steps and whether we needed to speak to the higher-ups about Logan's erratic behavior. My mind raced with the risks we were taking. Was this really worth it? Could we actually make a difference? Or were we just signing our own death warrants? One afternoon, the 6 of us occupied an empty conference room and spoke at length about Logan's dictatorial behavior and how the fired employees deserved justice. Unknown to all of us, we'd made the worst mistake of our lives. The very same day, while I was working on a project, Logan called me to his office. I felt a cold sweat break out and instantly wondered what this was about. The other employees gave me concerned stares, fearing I was the next victim, so to speak. But a devastating blow awaited me. "Take a seat, Ethan." I sat across Logan, trying not to look or sound overly anxious even though I was internally panicking. "Are you enjoying your time at the company, Ethan?" "It's been quite pleasant, sir." "Really? Nothing to complain about at all?" "I don't believe so, sir." "Well, that's good. I wanted your opinion on something. I heard someone talking about me and the board in a rather disrespectful way, and I wanted to know what you think about it." "Sure, sir, I can do that." I had no idea what Logan was up to, but as he rapidly typed things on his computer and opened applications, I felt my heartbeat rise with every clack of his keyboard. Finally, Logan turned to me and smiled, and I realized I'd walked into a trap. He pressed a button and played a recording, and what I heard next overwhelmed me with shock and shame. Logan's a ruthless fellow. I mean, he claims the board does things, but I'm really starting to wonder now because he's one twisted guy, and if the board knows about him, heck, they're all complicit in this nonsense too. Logan paused the recording and I felt every single cell in my body freeze. "You folks think you're discreet, huh?" Of course, I've bugged the conference room and I heard every word that was exchanged. "You see, Ethan, loyalty is everything here, and you've just disobeyed me. Your father was a loyal servant, but what a pity about you." Every fiber of my being wanted to escape the room, but I was trapped. Logan smiled in the most unnerving fashion. He walked over to me and placed a gentle hand on my shoulder. "Don't be frightened. I'm not going to fire you, but I'm going to teach you a valuable lesson. Now, for your disobedience, 2 of the 6 people from that room shall be suspended." My blood went cold. I was paralyzed with fear and couldn't believe what I was hearing. "If you disobey me again, or complain to anyone, or if you're a single minute late, I will fire everyone until you're the last of the 6 still working here. And I'll tell everyone that it was your negligence that led to their dismissal. Is that clear?" Logan patted my shoulder and left his cabin to attend a meeting. I sat in his cabin, frozen with shock and worry. I felt suffocated by the weight of Logan's ultimatum. How could I let my coworkers suffer for my actions? All 6 of them were so dear to me and promised to help in our fight against Logan. But all our efforts now seemed in vain. Logan had me right under his thumb, which meant that even the smallest act of defiance would be met with harsh consequences. To my shock, our group was disbanded that day itself. After I met with Logan, the others hounded me for questions, but I wasn't sure what to tell them. How could I tell them that our negligence now meant anyone could be fired at will? How could we be certain there was a meeting place in this office that wasn't bugged? It was too risky a decision. Just then, Logan returned to the floor and motioned everyone to gather around. I felt sick and my stomach was in knots. Good afternoon, everyone. I have an announcement to make. I was reviewing some of the projects with the board. Unfortunately, due to some subpar performances by Elliot and Mark. I remember just how helpless I was at that moment. Elliot and Mark were two co-workers part of our 6-person team, and they'd be chosen as Logan's targets for suspension. They've continued to deliver poor results under Ethan, who was leading the project, therefore they shall bear the brunt of his mistake. To make an example out of them for everyone here, both Elliot and Mark will be suspended for 2 months. That's all. Elliot and Mark's accusatory glances said it all. They blamed me for their suspension, and who could blame them? Logan had orchestrated the perfect betrayal. As Logan walked away and everyone gasped and speculated, one thing was very clear: stepping out of line was no longer an option. Logan's decisions kept everyone off balance and left us unable to predict what his next move could be. The state of constant fear and anxiety became draining for everyone. I was torn between standing up to him or suffering the consequences. Every decision I made felt like a potential death sentence for my colleagues. The weight of their careers rested on my shoulders. Later after office that day, our 6-person group gathered at a restaurant where I explained the situation about Logan. There was some natural skepticism, but the main concern was how could we get back at Logan. His father owned the company and Logan comfortably swayed control over the board and his department. There had to be some way to get back at him, but how? As all of us racked our brains, we had no idea the answer would arrive in the most unexpected form ever. The next day, I was late for work since my car wouldn't start. I rushed towards the subway to make it in time to the office. My heart leaped in my chest and Logan's words rang in my head: "I will fire everyone until you're the last of the 6 still working here." I couldn't get his words out of my mind. As I paced towards the subway, I noticed an old man fall to the pavement on the side opposite to me. It was an empty road and hardly anyone was around. I was fearful of Logan's actions but realized that the fear shouldn't come in the way of my humanity. I rushed immediately to the man's rescue and helped him up. He'd dropped a couple of boxes on the way to his truck. I loaded the boxes up for him in the back of his vehicle and gave him some water to sip on. He looked like a humble delivery man. "You feeling all right, sir? Do you need anything else?" "Thank you. I'm kind of dizzy right now, but I need to be somewhere with these boxes. Could you do me a massive favor and drive the truck?" "I'll guide you to the location, just drive me to the place." I felt distressed and caught in a terrible dilemma. On one hand, my late arrival meant that the fate of my coworkers hung in the balance. On the other hand, no one was around to drive the man and he was clearly in no state to go alone. He sensed my hesitance. "It's just 5 minutes from here. You can walk it up to the subway from there." Not wanting to waste any more time, I decided to drive the elderly gentleman to his location. The career of my friends was a terrible burden on my shoulders, but I couldn't abandon this man either. He needed my help. Within 5 minutes, we reached the location. I watched in awe as we arrived at the gate. It was a beautiful and sprawling mansion. The gate was open for us, and the man asked me to park the car near the entrance. We got out of the truck and I started to help with the boxes, but the man asked me to stop. "I'll take care of that." He pulled out an old wallet and walked up to me. "Let me offer you something for your trouble. I couldn't have got these boxes here in time if it weren't for you." "It's absolutely all right, sir. It's the least I could do." It may have seemed like a foolish decision, but it was something my father had taught me when I was young. No acts of kindness should be carried out with the expectation of a reward. All I'd done was help an elderly man for 15 minutes. I couldn't possibly accept any reward for that. I glanced at my watch and realized it was time to rush. "I'm glad I could be of help, sir. I'm running a bit late now, so I'll be on my way." The elderly man smiled as I bolted out of the property. I rushed towards the subway and caught the first train after a long wait, but by the time I arrived at the office, I was 40 minutes late. Everyone stared at me as I rushed in, flustered and out of breath. Logan stepped out of his cabin, fuming. He gave me a cold, cruel stare and I instantly knew I'd messed up. "What had I told you, Ethan?" Wasn't I clear that if you're a single minute late, I would raise holy hell for you? Sir, I'm incredibly sorry. I was helping an elderly man unload boxes from his truck and… Oh, so that's what you get paid for? To load and unload boxes. You know what, Ethan? I've let you drag me and this company done for too long. Enough is enough. You're fired. Loud gasps filled the office air as I struggled to come to terms with what I'd just heard. It couldn't be. Sir, you can't do this. Of course I can. It's honestly my fault. Fools like you deserve blue-collar jobs anyway. Now pack your things and get out. My coworkers were conflicted and those from our group stood up in my defense, but Logan shut everyone down through sheer verbal force. Sit down, all of you. Any of you speak up and you are next. As the office remained fearfully silent, I cleared up my desk and walked out of the building. It felt like my heart had been snapped into two. Despite the torture I'd endured under Logan's thumb, I was lost as to how I'd navigate life now. What about my coworkers? How would I find a new job again? The questions ate away at me as I took the subway back home. There was a cafe near the subway where I sat for a couple of hours, wondering about my next course of action. Is this how my father had felt? All my emotions came surging to me and I couldn't figure out how to deal with the situation. Lost and confused, I decided to head back home. As I was walking back from the cafe, I passed by the same mansion where I'd dropped the elderly man that morning. As I peeked near the gate, I was in for an absolute shock. The elderly gentleman was sitting comfortably on a massive lawn, smoking a cigar. I stood there for a moment, stunned by what I was seeing. Suddenly, a security guard emerged out of nowhere and glared at me. "What do you want?" "Keep walking, punk. I was just having a look. I helped the elderly man there this morning." "Yeah, I'm sure you did and we all believe you. Now get out of here." "I'm serious." "Well, so am I, if you don't get out of here in the next 10 seconds. All the commotion attracted the elderly man's attention and he walked towards the gate. As soon as he laid eyes on me, he smiled and asked the guard to calm down. "It's all right, Stephen, I know him. Let him in." The guard grumpily opened the gate and let me inside the property. The elderly man smiled and ushered me inside the mansion. "Sir, I had no idea you owned this place, You thought I was a mover or something?" "No, I just meant." The old man laughed heartily. "I get that all the time. It's fine. Come on in. Tea?" "Yes, please, mister." "Call me Owen." "What's your name?" "I'm Ethan." "Well, Ethan, welcome to my home." Owen welcomed me inside his palatial home, and I was served tea in a silver cup. It was baffling to think the same gentleman I was helping this morning owned this entire property. Owen explained that he liked doing chores on his own sometimes, and his father used to be a mover back in the day. When Owen was young, he'd help his father out, and it was a habit he never let go of. "I noticed you seemed quite distressed this morning. Even more so right now." "It's really nothing." "Speak your mind, Ethan. What's the matter?" Perhaps it was the overwhelming stress and devastation of losing my job, but in Owen's comfort, I let out everything on my mind, venting about Logan, the workplace, and the suffering I'd endured. Owen seemed shocked beyond belief at certain points, but as I finished, a sly smile appeared on his face. He took a sip of his tea and looked at me. "So, my son fired you?" "Son? What are you talking about, Owen?" I was extremely confused as Owen leaned forward and smiled. "Ethan, my name is Owen Donovan. Logan Donovan is my son." My mind raced with a whirlwind of emotions, shock at Owen's identity and sheer disbelief at the turn of events. This felt unreal. I stammered and became speechless, unable to take in the gravity of this unexpected connection. Owen simply smiled. "Ethan, your father was one of the most hard-working men I'd ever seen in my life. Logan told me that Russell retired on his own, but I had no idea this was all his doing." Owen was equally shocked. We concluded that Logan lied to me and tried to pin my father's dismissal on Owen. Owen further speculated that Logan, perhaps spurred by jealousy, set out to ruin my father, as he was to be promoted and replace Logan. I sat speechless, processing everything I'd heard. It was impossible to believe that such a humble and kind man like Owen could father someone as ruthless as Logan. The contrast between their characters was baffling. "We have to take some measures now. I haven't been keeping in the best of health, which is why I've not been so active in the company, but I think it's time to step back in." Owen's unexpected connection to Logan felt like a lifeline. Perhaps I wasn't as helpless as I thought. For the first time, I saw a crack in Logan's armor which my coworkers and I could finally use. Owen's support could tip the scales and bring about the justice we all deserve. I was at Owen's mansion for several hours as we formulated a plan for our next steps. Honestly, I could have never imagined how everything would play out after this. The very next day, I dressed up for the office as usual. Owen picked me up outside my home in his limousine. I stepped inside and was shocked to find Jean, Dan, Elliot, and Mark. It was all the people who'd been forced out of the company. I stared at Owen, dumbfounded. "How did you?" "Just get in, you'll see." All of us spoke in hushed whispers as Owen's limousine took us to the office building. I was aware that Owen would be confronting Logan, but the presence of all the other dismissed co-workers signaled something more significant. Owen had a bigger plan in mind. Even though we spoke softly, nobody in the car had any exact details on what Owen had planned. We'd just have to wait and find out. The limousine arrived at the building entrance and Owen asked us to wait at the office and said he'd come up in a minute. Terrified but united, all of us returned to our old office floor where the employees were astonished to see us. The commotion caused Logan to barge out of his office and he stared at us, equally dumbstruck as the others. He then shifted from shock to fury. "What on earth are all of you doing here? You pathetic band of losers." Logan locked his glaring eyes with mine. He looked ready to explode. "Was this your idea? To join forces with your loser gang and come barging in here? You're even worse than your father. Is that how you speak about someone's father, boy?" Everyone moved back to make way for Owen. His very presence filled us with a massive sense of relief. Logan's face fell, switching from a tyrannical boss to a scared child in an instant. "Dad, what are you doing here?" "I'm here to set you straight, son. Your charade's been going on for far too long. I take a break for a couple of years and you burn this place to the ground. Get rid of hard-working employees to save your own face. I'm ashamed of you, Logan." Logan struggled to speak, all his rage and ego gone in an instant. I had an emergency call with the board. I even spoke to the folks in HR. "You're fired, Logan," with immediate effect. Jean will be taking over as head of department and Elliot, Mark, Ethan, and Dan will be reinstated back into the company. They have grounds to file for a civil lawsuit and they'll be doing exactly that with support from my lawyers. Civil suit. What are you saying? Why don't you tell everyone here that you planted sensitive evidence to have employees fired? That you consulted neither HR nor the board and fired people at will? Logan was shattered. Words seemed to fail him at the moment as Owen walked over to him and gave him a stern look. He pointed towards me. "The old man Ethan helped yesterday, an act that got him fired." "That was me, Logan. Your father. His act of kindness helped bring about all of this." Logan was devastated by this revelation. I smiled to myself. What goes around indeed comes around. I was overwhelmed with the irony of the situation. Helping an elderly man cost me my job, but it also brought me directly to the person who now changed my fate. "You fired Ethan's father, Russell. A good, honest man. Apologize to him right now. Admit what you did in front of everyone." I couldn't believe Owen asked Logan to do this. It was an embarrassing public humiliation for him, no doubt. But it was an odd sense of justice for everything my father had been through. Logan walked over to me, dejected and with a bowed head. "I'm sorry I lied, Ethan. I was the one who fired your father. Let this be a lesson to you, son. Now get out." As Logan stepped out of the office, a triumphant sense of relief and justice spread across the room. Everyone burst into laughter, applause, and a profound sense of happiness. It was a new beginning for all of us. In the days that followed, Owen and the board unanimously fired Logan. Owen's strong lawyers even helped construct a compelling civil lawsuit against Logan for planting evidence and trying to terminate employees. Jean, Dan, and the other wrongfully implicated employees could take everything Logan has and his future assets too. Additionally, Owen, after learning the truth about my father, visited my mother and paid off all our debts and my student loans as well. It was the beautiful sense of karmic justice. The office flourished under Jean's leadership and Owen returned to an active position at the firm. After everything we'd all painfully endured, we were awarded with the most satisfying justice we could have asked for.